This is Kristen Gishek from the Center for Automotive Research. We're going to get started here in just a moment. Give a few more people time to dial in, in holding mode for just a minute or two longer. Kristen Gishek. I am the Vice President of the Center for Automotive Research. We are happy to welcome you to our webinar on the implications of the UAW Detroit 3 contract negotiations in 2019. I'm going to turn over control for a moment here to Brent Snavely. Brent is a director at Lambert Edwards, a PR firm, but has covered many rounds of negotiations as a journalist, most notably for the Free Press, where he won awards for his UAW coverage. I'd like to turn it over to Brent for just a minute to sort of give you the run of show and how this is going to all work.
Sure. Well, thank you, Kristen, and thank you for having me here today. I'm looking forward to being a part of this. We, as I think everybody knows it's dialed in, we have a great group of panelists lined up for you, which includes Kristen, but also includes Marty Malloy, who is a former Vice President of Labor Affairs for Ford Motor Company, and Art Schwartz, who is a former General Director of Labor Relations for General Motors. So we've got a former Ford guy and a former GM guy here with us today. What we're going to do essentially is Kristen will open up with an overview of what came out of the 2019 contract negotiations and some analysis and assessment of it. That will go for probably around 10 minutes or so, and then we will have a good discussion that I will lead. And from there, we will be taking your questions during that time and wrap up with maybe a half hour or so of Q&A at the end. And one other thing that I should mention is that we have, and many of you have already noticed this, we have posted a polling question to just with a few topics to see what might be the most popular topic that this group wants us to talk about or spend more time on as we go through the discussion. So again, everybody, thanks for joining. Really appreciate your attention today. And now I will turn it back over to Kristen.
Thank you, Brent, and thanks to Marty and Art, some of our fellow travelers, for being here. Process and their thoughts on what happened in 2019. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I'll try to get through the wrap up fairly quickly. So I'm going to cover a summary of the 2019 agreements and some of the labor cost competitive positions that CAR traditionally estimates. This is the first time we'll be revealing those numbers publicly. We'll start with the ratification timeline. So, negotiations opened up in the summer. The contracts were set to expire on the 14th of September. The UAW, right after Labor Day, chose GM as the lead company. At midnight on the 15th, the UAW had a strike at GM, which ultimately lasted 40 days. They reached a tentative agreement on October 16th, stayed out on strike while they ratified that agreement, which was ratified at a fairly healthy margin. On the 25th of October, a very quick ratification. I think if Marty and Art would agree, that generally takes about 2 weeks, but with workers still out walking the picket lines, it was important to get that done in an expeditious manner. They turned quickly then to Ford, where they reached a tentative agreement by November 8th, which ratified a week later on the 15th, and then to Chrysler, where the tentative agreement came on November 30th, and ratification on the 11th of December, just in time for signing bonuses to happen before the holiday. So that was our run of the ratification timeline. There's a tale of the tape. So who won, who lost is always a big question. And, it's kind of somewhere in the middle is my assessment. So the UAW went into this looking for greater job security. I don't see anything in the contract that improved the job security provisions that they already had in place. So I give that an equal. They wanted greater job security, and they got about what they had. Now, they did get a lot of plant investments, a tremendous amount of plant investments, and that is one form of job security. So you could call that a plus. But in terms of the language around sub and transitional support and all of those job security provisions and the plant closing moratorium, nothing really changed. Income security, subpayments and transitional support, nothing changed there as well, so that is equal. Benefit security, I guess you can count it as a gain that healthcare did not change to the negative. There were many articles written about the companies needing to control healthcare costs and also looking to improve healthcare outcomes. The UAW emerged from this negotiation with no changes to their healthcare or their cost share. There were a few benefit improvements at Ford and at Chrysler, but essentially benefits remained exactly the same as they were before. They did get a lot of investment in the U.S. The Detroit Hamtramck closure at GM was reversed, and $22.7 billion in total Detroit 3 investments. As I said, that is a form of job security communication to the members that if they're going to put a lot more money into your plant, you might be around for a while. And then another UAW demand, temps made permanent. The temps to permanent pathway on a timeline is the case at Ford and General Motors only. FCA agreed to give preferential hiring to their UAW FCA members, but there is no set timeline as of a certain date that temps would become permanent. So the UAW went into this looking for guarantees and certainty, and they didn't lose anything. They kept a lot of what they already had and moved forward with more investments and that pathway for temporary workers, as well as some wage and lump sum gains. Now, on the company side, they were looking for a way to have contingent pay. So they like lump sums, profit sharing, that when the company is doing well, they can also share that with the members, but not get locked into higher costs. And so we see, if contingent pay remains, profit sharing remains, and these lump sum guarantees that don't roll into base. They like contingent work, that is temporary work. the ability to flex the workforce and have people who they can lay off without any cost, the temporary. So they do have some continuation of use of temporary workers and reliance on temporary workers. They like lump sums, and they've kept those. And at Ford and General Motors, there were some plant closures. Now, I have not been able to get to an estimate of what that saves those two companies over the course of the next 4 years, but it is a fixed cost savings, not a variable cost savings, to close the Lordstown Assembly, Baltimore and Warren Transmission, and Ford's Romeo engine, all plants that were underutilized, had underutilization on a capacity footprint. They maintain the authority to make footprint decisions, and that's something notable. I think that usually when you see these investments in the U.S., the past highlighters of the contracts have said this is a decision that was reversed from work that was meant for Mexico and is now going to be in the U.S. You didn't see any of that in these contracts. There were no reversals of plant investments. The decision about where the companies are going to make their products remain on the company side of things. So they have that flexibility. That didn't change. And despite all of the pressure on healthcare costs that rank up at about $1 billion a year at Ford and General Motors at least, they did not achieve any healthcare cost sharing. So what they looked for, what the automakers looked for, was flexibility. And they maintained a lot of flexibility and are going to see some higher costs as this contract rolls forward. So every year when I've looked at negotiations, I try to summarize thousands and thousands of pages of documents on one page for the UAW contract summary. I'm not going to go into every bit of detail, but this one does have bold indicating the changes from the 2015 contract. So the signing bonuses, $9,000 to $11,000 for permanent workers, $3,500 to $4,500 for temporary workers. You see the 3% wage increases in the second and fourth years of the contract, and the 4% lump sums in the first and third. By moving the wage increases to the second and fourth year, we do see lower cost increase overall because that accrual doesn't happen as early. Importantly, a 4-year grow into the top wage for workers who are already on roll at the time these contracts were signed. So that effectively eliminates the 2-tier wage for a certain group of workers. We'll talk a little bit more about that. A new temporary wage for future temps hired under the 2019 contract at Ford and General Motors at $16.67, and no wage progression. There is still a wage progression for temporary workers at FCA. The job commitments, 7,900 jobs at FCA, 8,500 at Ford, and there was, I don't believe there was a number for the jobs at GM, but that total number of investment, $4.5 billion new and $4.6 billion already announced at FCA. The $6 billion new at Ford includes $1.1 billion that we at CAR had already seen announced. So it's $6 billion announced in the contract, but 1.1 was already known, and $7.7 billion at GM. That does not include any of their investments around their joint venture with LG and the battery space that they're going to put near the Lordstown plant. There were some retirement incentives aimed at, calling a little bit of the more expensive workers out of the workforce, as well as people at underutilized plants, and especially targeted at some of the plants that are closing. The profit sharing, there's an improvement in the formula at FCA. The caps were removed at FCA and GM. That they did have a cap that was in place in 2015. That's been removed in 2019, and Ford had already removed that in the 2015 contract. There was a retirement contribution for legacy workers into their employee savings program, and the other bonuses remain in place. It's about $1,500 a year across the board. I'm missing one of those. I'm sorry. On FCA, there is a $1,500, up to $1,500 at FCA. Healthcare, there's no changes to the worker contribution, and they removed the distinction between the traditional and in progression plans at FCA, which is something that Ford and GM moved further along in the 2015 contract, because as you may recall, FCA went first, and this was something that Ford and GM agreed to after the FCA contract was ratified. Those in-progression wage increases for on-roll employees provide very sharp and distinct increases for workers with lower seniority. So a worker who was hired in 2019 prior to the signing of the contract would see a 90% increase in their wages over the next 4 years. Those are, less sharp for legacy workers. They get just the 2-3% bumps, but there's, very, very sharp increases for those workers who were called in progression before, but in 2007 were the second tier. So a big question I get is, did they really get rid of tiers? And so I took a look at the GM wage scales. There's a different wage scale for skilled trades, for apprentices, for production workers hired before and after 2007 and after 2019, temporary workers hired before 2019 and after 2019, at the GMCH plants that are the former Delphi facilities, if you were hired before 2015 or after, and at the CCA or the warehousing and distribution plants that were, if you were hired before 2015 or after 2015. So I do want to note that the 2019 production hires after 2019 for in-progression workers, I only take them to $23 because that is as far as they can get in 4 years on the regular 8-year grow-in. We have another contract in 2023, and that all may change. So they will get as far as $23 if they are hired right after the signing of these contracts. So did they get rid of the tiers? For on-roll production workers and wages, yes. These workers still have different benefits, still don't have a pension, and don't have retiree health care. All of their post-employment benefits are pay-as-you-go dollars now into 401k type plans. The temp to permanent pathway at Ford and GM, they've converted a number of people as of the beginning of this month. I think GM just announced today that they had converted something like 1,500 people to full-time. Next year, we'll start to see those rolling conversions. At GM, it's only temporary full-time workers with 2 or more years of continuous service as a temporary full-time. At Ford, you can have some of that service, at least 12 months of it be full-time, but 1 year, up to 1 year could be as a temporary part-time worker. And they do enter the wage progression at their seniority step. So if they've got 2 years, they're going to start the wage progression at the 2-year step. At FCA, they did not give us that time frame, but they are giving the supplemental workers priority for new hiring, and there's 7,900 new jobs promised in the 2019 agreements. All automakers are going to increase their U.S. share of North American production and decrease shares in Canada and Mexico over the next 4 years. I'm showing the increases in volume and then increases in the boxes and increases in share on the charts for U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and divided that between the Detroit 3 and the international firms. In the international firms, there are some not international firms. I should start calling them something else. Tesla and other companies are in that share as well. So a sharp increase in the U.S. share of North American production in the U.S. for the Detroit 3 automakers, going from 66% to 71%. And despite having new plants in Mexico for the international firms, they're still going to have 2% lower share in Mexico and an increase in volume for the international firms of about 2% in Mexico. But the D3 are going to be down, and Mexico volumes overall are going to be down over the next 4 years. And this is a blend from IHS and LMC forecasts. So another question I get is, what exactly goes into hourly labor costs? And it's wages, and that's often what gets misreported. That, when you hear that the average hourly labor costs were $78 in 2007, people were outraged that auto workers made $78 an hour. Wages are just one component. There are also shift premiums, overtime, PTO and holiday, income security, so that's the subpay and transitional support, profit sharing, bonuses, health insurance, life and disability insurance, pension and 401k contributions, all the statutory payroll taxes and workers' comp and UI, and other benefits such as legal services and the like. So there's a lot that goes into hourly labor costs. And then once you have estimates for all of that, you have to know what the workforce composition is. So how much is legacy production, in-progression production, skilled trades, apprentices, temporary or supplemental employees. So all of that can change. If everything was the same, your wages are the same across all three companies, all of your shift premiums are the same, you can still have very different outcomes in labor costs based on workforce composition. And the other big factor there is profit sharing, which is very different for the three companies. So our estimated average hourly labor cost changes for 2023 brings FCA up to about $66 an hour. They were at $55 in 2019. Brings Ford to $69 an hour in 2023. They were at $61, and GM $71 an hour, and they were at $63. So this is increasing labor costs steadily from the 2015, 2019, 2023 contracts. And remember, of course, the 2015 contracts included 2 3% raises for the legacy workers, as well as some significant improvements for in progression workers. But the overall labor costs are a function of all those other things on the other slide, the workforce composition, profit sharing, all of that. So the labor cost changes do not go up necessarily at the same rate as the wages. The per vehicle labor cost changes, there are some big changes here. We estimate that FCA's per vehicle labor costs are about $3,500, Ford's around $3,100, and GM around $3,400. FCA's is a little higher than the other two, and a sharper increase, largely because of just their productivity in the plants that they have so far, and a historical pattern on that. So that's where we see per vehicle labor cost changes coming out. Vis-a-vis the North American non-union auto firms, or the U.S. non-union auto firms, in 2019, we thought that the non-union producers were around $50 an hour, so that's the cost competitiveness vis-a-vis the other firms. And in 2023, that number went up to about $52 an hour. So slight increase over the next 4 years projected, not quite as sharp as we saw for the Detroit 3. So the gap with the non-union automakers has widened quite a bit. But with those kinds of numbers, you know, $66, $69, $71, I know that some folks were thinking, well, that's getting awfully close to those big numbers we saw in 2007. If you look at it in nominal terms, yes, there's a rebound. The $78 an hour at GM, $76 an hour at FCA, and Ford's estimate was $68 an hour in 2007. Those do start to rebound above those numbers. But in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, in 2007 dollars, we are well below where we were in 2007 in terms of average hourly labor costs. So there's not a big ballooning liability coming. There's not, you know, runaway inflation in average hourly labor costs. In fact, these changes and increases in real terms are quite modest coming out of 2015, and 2019 contracts where there were significant gains for the workforce. And with that, I'm going to hand it to you.
Well, thanks, Kristen. That was a lot of good information that was presented very quickly. And I think probably what jumps out there is the projected increase in the labor cost. We'll get into that a little bit later. I have some questions for the group on that. I thought I would just start, and that we should just start kind of at the beginning of this round of negotiations. You know, they always officially start things off with a ceremonial handshake, and I think even then, this time around, things were more tense than they often were, and thought I would just ask, the strike was a big difference this year, and a first national strike in a long time. Do you guys think that could have been avoided given the context leading up to this round of contract negotiations?
Well, I'll jump in first on this one. I think a strike was pretty much inevitable. And I said so going in, so I'm not doing hindsight analysis on this. A couple of factors led to that. The first was the problem with the investigation of the UAW, and the leadership was very nervous about the rank and file, and they wanted to make sure that, first of all, the rank and file were solidified behind them, and secondly, I think they wanted to divert some of the focus from the investigation. And secondly, ever since November of 2018, when General Motors had announced the plants being unallocated, the UAW had been trying to get them reallocated back and not been successful. And there was going to take a strike whether they got the plants back or not, just to show the rank and file that they were strong on this subject, and if nothing else, to punish GM for closing plants. So those two things, and kind of the fact that there hasn't been a strike for a long time, and I thought that it was inevitable. Now, the fact that it lasted 6 weeks, I didn't see. I didn't think it would last more than 2 weeks. And I don't know why it had to last 6 weeks, but that's another subject to talk about.
Well, I think another factor, too, was the ratification votes in 2015. We saw FCA members reject their first agreement, threw that little fish back and got it what they thought was a bigger fish and ratified it strongly, 70+% ratification. And then we turned to Ford for the cleanup, batting cleanup in third position in 2015. They barely got over the line of 50-point-something%. So I think those narrow ratification at Ford, the rejection at FCA also led to an increasing militance from the union to show the members that they were really working hard for them.
Great.
So what I had always heard, and I've seen the UAW say, is a strike is a last resort. And it's a last resort because it's a big risk, and for both the UAW and the members that will get paid less during a strike, and for the companies as well. Why? So I was wondering, with that risk that they took, jumping right into a national strike, do you think the UAW gained anything from that they would not have gained through just regular, straight, tough bargaining?
This is Marty. I'm looking back again historically, 61 to 76. During those master agreement contract periods, there's an average strike about 33 and a half days per contract. So striking was just a common. This was part of the negotiations process. And then we went, with the exception of a very, very brief strike in the early 70s. We went 43 years without a strike. So just stepping back, there's got to be an assignable cause. What statistically, why would we have such a difference? And let's face it, from 61 to 76, there really wasn't much competition. It was an oligopoly, and we just shifted the cost, right, to the consumer. But we couldn't, after the oil embargo, life changed in the automotive industry, and for the OEMs, a strike is extraordinarily expensive. I think General Motors, this cost them $3 billion. Plus, in addition to that, your brand really gets damaged terribly. And nightly news is politicians coming forward and just destroying your brand, which you covet and protect. So, a strike is an extraordinary set of circumstances, and quite frankly, as long as this strike lasted, I would have thought there would have been something radically different in the agreement, one way or another. And the agreement basically came out as pretty much one would expect. The general wage increases were there. They were there prior set in 2015. As Kristen mentioned, there was no really language that was new and breakthrough. So, quite frankly, I was very surprised that it was a strike that lasted that long.
Yeah, the question comes up, was the strike worth it? And as Marty points out, it doesn't seem to be. If you remember, right before the strike deadline, General Motors came up with a new proposal. And Terry Dittis said, oh, if I'd only gotten that earlier, we could have done something with that. Well, it's not uncommon to give the other side a better offer right before a deadline, and usually expect that's going to come. And my question is, why not just delay the strike deadline, bargain for another couple days, and maybe you get a deal, and you don't all the pain that went on doesn't happen. But that's not what happened. That's because I think the strike was part of the strategy all along for the UAW.
Yeah, and I could add one other point. My experience in the past is that, for instance, Ron Gelfinger, who's president of the UAW, for instance, the National Ford Department vice president, who was basically running labor within that OEM, really, when it came to national bargaining, the person at the end of the day who's making the really tough calls on economics and the key issues, which are pattern negotiations issues, which hits the other OEM, is the president of the UAW. And that's really a key role because you have the national bargainers there and everyone's got their special interest. But it's the president of the UAW who steps in, makes the tough calls at the end of the day, and then you come to the final solution of here's what the negotiation package is going to look like. And from what I've read in the press and taken is that it was more of a committee this time. And committees have a more difficult making those final tough calls and sorting through the special interests than one strong leader like Ron Gelfinger was, or Bob King did the same thing.
I think the other point is, I mean, strikes are costly on the company side, certainly, but they're extremely costly on the membership. There were members who lost their lives on the picket lines. There were members who, had great financial damage to, their households, earning $250 a week in strike pay. It did get raised to $275, but there's an enormous human cost of being out on strike, and it is not a weapon that should be and is wielded lightly. I was also surprised it went on as long as it did, but there's tremendous cost on all sides.
Absolutely.
And this might be a little bit of inside baseball, but one of the things that happened that was closely watched by you guys as former labor negotiators was, that the same day the UAW announced that it would call a national strike, GM came out and published the terms of the offer that it had been offering. And usually, that how unusual was that, and what did that tell you about the tenor of the relationship at that point between the company and the union?
Well, I'll take first crack at that one. It is unusual. Usually the parties never release the intermediate demands. There's kind of a prohibiting bargaining in the press. This looked like bargaining in the press, and I think the reason it was done was the bargainers at GM were reacting to the UAW's comment that GM had not moved on anything. And they felt, that's almost like an accusation of bargaining in bad faith. And they released this in order to show, yes, we have moved on some things. And they were hoping, I think probably they were hoping that it would look good enough that maybe the strike might be postponed, but unfortunately that didn't happen. That's just speculation on my part. I don't know.
I agree with Art. Sometimes you have different practices in different countries. For instance, in Australia, it would be the kind of practice you would literally give a full report after every bargaining session. It would be published by the union. This certainly isn't the practice within the OEMs here and the UAW. I was surprised they went public with it.
And given that, I'll just take that one step farther. One of the things I often have heard is that negotiations never really end. You're always negotiating, always talking between the company and the union. And I was just, how true is that? And what does what's the flip side of this? What does a healthy relationship look like with, in union and corporation labor relations?
Well, the first part of the question, when you start negotiating, quite frankly, given the product cycle time and how long it takes to take a vehicle to the market and where you're going to put product sourcing, I would expect all the OEMs right now are going through those cycle plans to understand where they're going to land in 4 years, because the number one issue really in bargaining at the end of the day, I think, is job security. Chris mentioned it earlier. And so this is a constant this is a constant process. In terms of engaging with the union, literally at Ford, it was a monthly process. The president of the UAW, the vice president of the National Ford Department, the president of the Americas at the time, which would be the number 2 operating person in the company, the vice president, executive vice president of manufacturing, and the chief negotiator, the vice president of labor. When we meet once a month, we go through all the business issues, we go through macroeconomic issues, we go through what was on the docket, labor issues of the day, which were topical. The union would have an opportunity to speak their piece, but it was important in those meetings. It lasted about 2 hours. That all the members got to know each other. There was no surprises. It wasn't just a polite exchange of information. It was a dialogue. And if you're continuing this, you get a rhythm. By the time you get into, quote, formal bargaining, most of the issues have been thoroughly discussed. So now it's basically getting down to the formality of putting the committees together and letting them also engage in that dialogue. So by the time you're getting down to the close of negotiations, it's more of an interest-based bargaining exercise in which the parties understand each other's positions, and the probability of misjudging one another and getting into a strike is dramatically reduced.
So,
if I can jump in, I think, another part of this is that there were new leaders on both sides, on the company and the union side, new president of the UAW who hadn't led national negotiations before in that role, new vice presidents at Ford and GM, and although Cindy Estrada had led national negotiations, not at FCA. So new leaders on all sides sort of restarts some of that process that had to happen going back to their convention where those leaders were installed on the UAW side, and then company side personnel changed a bit too. And I think also we can't ignore the November 26th announcement from GM that it was going to unallocate product to 4 plants in the U.S. That's when the UAW campaign started, the "we invested in you, now you have to invest in us," that carried through all the way through bargaining. So I think there were 2 sort of restarts. One is new people, and then a very shocking announcement from GM about unallocating the product late last year that kind of changed some of this dynamic.
So there was GM with its plant issues that were announced many months before the contract negotiations began. New leaders, new leadership, and of course the federal investigation hanging over all of this. And so with all of that, I'm sure that the UAW went into this with some kind of a strategy. And looking at it from the outside, and I've heard others talk about this as well, do you think there was, where the contract ended up, was there a prioritization by the UAW to go for wages and benefits here over plant investment? How did that dichotomy balance out, and that push-pull of wages and benefits versus plant investments play out from your perspective, Art, in this round of contract negotiations?
Well, usually they're going for both. The economics are very important, but the job security, especially recently, has become much more important. We eliminated in the negotiations, in the bankruptcy negotiations, the jobs bank, which was a big cost loser for the company, making labor essentially a fixed cost. That took away some job security from the membership. So the tool the union has now is investment, and so they're going to go out and do the investment, and they got some decent numbers. We'll see how it plays out. I think over the last, Kristen probably knows better than I do, over the last negotiations of the last contract period, the obligation, the commitments versus what actually went in were fairly close.
No, they exceeded them. So they promised $21 billion of investment in the 2015 contract, and our tracking of those investments is every single company exceeded its target, and it was $23 billion promised in the 2019 contract, so about a 10% increase.
Yeah. I don't think it's an either or for job security or wages. I mean, there's kind of an expectation that the membership had of what economics are going to be, especially since the companies are doing well financially. Profit sharing has been a pleasant surprise, I think, to the union. They've gotten some nice checks, and they've gotten pay increases. So actually, it was both rather than either or in this negotiation.
I agree with that. I think this is one thing I think's changed over the last, 20, 30 years is the UAW is much better informed than the cycle plants. And if you go back in prior years, the UAW wouldn't really understand the cycle plant that's coming forward. Now the information is available to the UAW. They know what's coming out. And again, going back to Kirsten's opening comments about the importance of job security, they understand what's going to be happening in the future, and they could react to it.
And Marty,
these are
sorry, one second. Marty, maybe define what you mean by cycle plant and what that is.
It's basically your vehicles, which vehicles are going to come and go, what plans, and where you're allocating the. And obviously, it's not just the vehicle; it's the powertrain, so on and so forth. And obviously, that's driving the jobs.
Well, and the UAW took an unusual stance at their bargaining convention of releasing a research paper about change to electrification. I mean,
right.
That shows that they have, a lot of deep insight into where things are going. And I just want to point out, one of the things Art said was, the UAW membership is expecting wage increases when times are going well. If you go back to the early bargaining years of your career, Art, and probably Marty, in the Stone Age, it was 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3% every year. And the film that we were discussing at lunch, if you haven't watched it, you should. If you're interested in bargaining, Final Offer, it's on the National Film Board of Canada website for free to watch. It's the story of the breakaway of Unifor, then was a department of the UAW, the Canadian department. It became CAW and now Unifor. But there's a guy in there, they're out on strike at Oshawa, and they've got a deal that's not 3% every year, and they are just pounding the table like, well, damn it, we've gotten 3% every year. 3% was very common, and we have been away from that for a long time. There were almost 10 years with no wage increases.
3% plus COLA.
Yeah, and there was COLA, which is eliminated at FCA and Ford, but not completely eliminated at GM. Sorry, Art. That language is still in the contract.
So COLA, and then COLA for those, we have an informed crowd here, but cost of living adjustment, allowance. Sorry. So maybe Marty, Kristen showed the slide earlier that does show and projects a pretty big labor cost increase over the next couple of years, from the mid-50s for each of the Detroit Three into essentially the mid-60s. How concerned are you about that? How concerned should the industry be? What are the implications for those kind of labor costs on the competitiveness of the Detroit Three?
I got to go back to Kristen said. In fact, she mentioned about if you take the number, but if you take the inflation versus where we were before. I go back to 2007. Our fully fringed cost was like $74, and our competition at the time, we were really focused on Toyota. It was at 47. Mm-hmm. If you take a look what the gap is, actually Toyota has been increasing because they've got legacy employers and getting on and on and on. They're picking up OPEB costs.
Both Toyota and Honda are in that position now.
Right, and we don't have OPEB. So we did the
UAW. Other post-employment benefits, OPEB.
Excuse me. So now that was a change made in 2007 thanks to some really great bargaining at General Motors. They did a terrific job doing the Viva deal. But quite frankly, I'm pleased at the outcome of these last two agreements in terms of the cost structure going forward. There's so many other elements of cost that as you step back and look at all the things that were done in the restructuring effort. And if I look at it today, I think the bargaining that's taken place in the last two sessions was excellent.
Well, and the internationals don't sit still either. I mean, they did grow about $2 an hour over the next 4 years is my projection. But the makeup of the international firms here changes too. So, you didn't have, we have new plants that are launching. The Toyota Mazda plant is going to be down at the lower end of the grow-in for that. That really brings the international average down when you put in new plants launching and a whole entire workforce with nobody retired.
Right.
When the companies are doing well, it makes no sense to expect that labor costs aren't going to go up in the negotiations. That's just going to happen. But I would point out that most of, not all, but most of the economics in this are not structural. They're lump sum cash, bonuses, profit sharing. There are the 2-3% pay increase, which are structural.
And healthcare.
Well, healthcare, nothing happened.
No, but the costs will go up because costs
well,
will go up.
that's healthcare. Pensions, there was nothing, and that's another structural cost built in. So most of what's in here is cash, and when the companies are doing well, they can more easily afford the cash. The interesting thing will be the next time they bargain in a downturn, what's going to happen. And I hope that doesn't happen for a long, long time.
So I'll take that maybe one step farther. I'm just going to divert to a question, one of the questions that we got from the audience here, which is related to this conversation, and I'll just read that because I think it's a good follow-up, which is how will, and I think you essentially answered it, but how will GM, Ford, and FCA deal with the labor cost changes through 2023? Will the automakers need to pass those extra costs along to consumers or maybe suppliers or others? So it sounds like you think
suppliers.
You think that it's mostly cash, but I just thought you should maybe address that follow-up question.
Well, I think it's one we all can address. I mean, there are ways of addressing unit labor costs other than just compensation. I mean, productivity gains, technology. There's a variety of ways, and I know the companies have always tried to counterbalance increases with increases in productivity. I mean, technically, from an economist point of view, and I always hate to bring that up, if the pay goes up, pay should go up commensurate with productivity. So that doesn't affect your unit labor costs at all. So, and there's other things we can focus on too: material costs, suppliers.
Which also went up because of the trade disputes. We saw increases in
Well,
inputs.
I mean, I didn't say that the companies aren't juggling a lot of different balls.
They are.
And they have
But when those go away, then that.
Right. So there are alternatives to try and tax it. But anyone who went into this negotiations thinking that the labor cost would stay the same or go down was dreaming.
Very good. Okay, so I'll throw another term out and then ask a question from it. Another pattern bargaining is a term that I think many of us are familiar with on this call, and of course that exists between the UAW and the Detroit 3. But what about the pattern with suppliers? And do you see things in this contract with the Detroit 3 or themes in this contract that you think suppliers should be on watch for or be aware of that are coming out of this round of contract negotiations?
Well, looking back at 07 bargaining and 09 bargaining, which were really precedent setting, we had a lot of changes to our contract, which would have hit the suppliers, but it would hit them in a good way. For instance, when we ended COLA, you would think the supply community would end COLA because the suppliers are not, it shouldn't be richer than the OEM. When we put in the quote tier 2, we put in you would think the same thing would happen. So all these positive restructuring efforts to save the automotive business that were agreed upon in 07 and 09, you would think would flush down into the supply community, and they would also get benefits. Sitting back and looking at this set of contract negotiations, the GWI's
General wage increases.
Kristen mentioned before, the last general wage increase, the UAW prior to 2015 negotiation was 2005, and they gave up to 2006, which was in the contract, but it wasn't executed. So it's gone a long period of time. And given where the economy is right now, and given with the wage increase, particularly at the lower end of the scale, a general wage increase, which was granted in this contract, I would think would be normal in terms of the economy.
And the difficulty finding manufacturing workers across the board.
Right. So I don't see anything in this agreement which is earth-shattering. The only thing that I saw that was disappointing but not unexpected is the health care.
Yeah. But there's no brave new health care.
There's no brave new health care. And the OEMs I've done business with don't have the kind of health care deal that Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler people have. They've got cost sharing in their health care deals.
So on healthcare, we were at lunch earlier before this and chatting, and I heard a term that I've heard before, which is go to war issue. So Art, I thought maybe can you elaborate on that? Well, healthcare didn't change this year because it's a go to war issue, quote unquote. What does that mean, and why doesn't healthcare ever change?
Since I was quoted as saying that by one of your former colleagues, I guess I should try and answer that. What I mean by go to war is this is one the UAW would strike, period, over. The UAW, every time we tried to change health care, the UAW would come back to us and say, we could have gotten more in past contracts, but we chose instead to keep the virtual zero contribution health care. That was a conscious decision we made. So we're never going to give that up. And, we always try, and most of the time we would walk in and try and do co-pays, deductibles, premiums, which just enraged them. I think Ford's had a little better luck at what I call nibbling around the edges and trying to get wellness programs and
managed care for chronic conditions and things like that.
some things like strategy that doesn't take money out of people's pockets. But this is so ingrained within the UAW that it's going to be extremely difficult to get them to do more cost sharing, because in their mind they're giving up pay increases, they've given up pension increases in order to keep this.
Well, they have a very good point though. Cost sharing doesn't make it cost less. And in 2007, was it that the companies and the union agreed to study healthcare? They looked at forming the National Institute for Healthcare Reform, paid a bunch of researchers to do a lot of stuff to come up with what could they do to increase healthcare outcomes, improve healthcare outcomes, and lower costs overall. That was supposed to be rolled out in the 2015 UAW negotiations and was fumbled, I have to say, and didn't get any traction. And it was, not explained very well, I think, to the membership. And, anytime you touch this is a very emotional issue. It's also one that I don't think the automakers and the union can solve at the table themselves. I mean, the UAW has long been a supporter of single-payer health care. And when you do see federal changes in health care, like the Affordable Care Act, we saw a lowering of inflation rate for healthcare costs in the U.S. So we still see inflation. It's just not double-digit every year. It's not something that any of these companies can control or the union can control. But increasing cost share doesn't lower the cost. It's attacking bigger structural issues that, have to go beyond the bargaining table.
Well, that's it exactly. I mean, at the bargaining table, there's only a limited number of things you can change. And so far, they haven't changed. And I didn't expect them to change, and I don't think they'll change. I mean, now you're getting into an overall discussion of health care in the United States. I mean, we spend almost 18% of GDP on health care, which is way more than any other country in the world.
And our administrative costs are double what they are in Canada.
Right.
I think there was a good faith effort by the UAW's product research department in after 2011 negotiations to really get in and understand it better, trying to bend the cost curve versus cost shifting, as Kristen said. And I think they were making good progress in understanding it, but they just got scared off. I think they literally, a couple headlines on the front page of the local papers drew a lot of attention, and people got scared, and they basically got shut down. But it's unfortunate because at the end of the day, just not making progress in that area as a country.
I don't think it's an accident that in negotiations with the Canadian auto unions, healthcare is not a big issue at all.
No, and the Canadians do have a supplemental health care plan that the automakers pay for in Canada on top of the federal and provincial plans. You know, a look at both sides of the border. You know, Canadians do have a cost share. They're paying about $360 a year out of pocket for premiums for that cost sharing plan. But they have, you know, very, very limited out of pocket costs for anything else. Whereas, you know, and as you know, the UAW members do as well, you know, other people in industry, you know, across manufacturing, across the whole U.S. economy, 30% cost share is very common. And, you know, many families in the U.S. go bankrupt over healthcare costs, and UAW members don't.
So, and that's a good segue, Kristen. I've another topic to address here is, you know, of course, next year we will have Unifor Contract negotiations with the Detroit 3 in Canada. This year. It's already 2020. That's right. So that would be this year. Anyway, so thoughts on what you saw in last year's UAW contract negotiations, what that might mean, what those implications might be for this year's Unifor talks.
Well, I think, you know, there's two big issues that are changing that kind of came in the midst of the negotiations that we haven't talked about yet. One is GM suing FCA. Mm-hmm. And that RICO suit, you know, I don't know what will happen with it, and I don't really want to comment on the validity of it or anything, but that's going to be working its way through the courts this year. And then FCA-PSA merger, which may or may not be consummated by the time they are talking about contracts this fall at the Detroit 3 plants in Canada. It is, you know, Canada's a shrinking footprint of these companies, with Oshawa likely to phase out, or, you know, they're not building vehicles at Oshawa anymore. The national negotiation for GM is about one plant. It's about what's going to happen with this few hundred workers at Oshawa and the St. Catharines powertrain plant. The other plants in Canada, CAMI in Ingersoll, the Equinox plant, they negotiate in an off year, so they don't go till 2021. The Ford footprint is remarkably smaller as well, with just one assembly plant, and then the powertrain operations in Windsor, Essex, and Brampton and Windsor and Etobicoke for FCA. I mean, it's a very, very much smaller set of negotiations. You know, I think those two issues are changes. And, you know, we have, again, I'm going to watch Final Offer. There's a lot of very interesting things in that tell you what's different about Unifor versus the UAW. But, you know, the union in Canada has long resisted profit sharing. Profit sharing has been paying out, you know, very healthy checks for the last, you know, since 2009. And, you know, I know Jim Stanford, who used to be the chief economist there, said it's slot machine economy. You know, we don't want to have workers dependent on a portion of their pay, their compensation, that can be there one year and not the next. They'd prefer to do base wage increases. They did do a push for job security to make the Ingersoll plant the lead plant for GM for the products that they build. They had a little strike during CAMI negotiations, and the strike ended without any guarantee that they would be the lead plant. I think, you know, they have a lot of challenges ahead, and this contract does set them up for wage increases, sets them up for some lump sums, but, you know, there's a lot of pressure on them too about, you know, what if you take on profit sharing now in Canada and the companies all of a sudden become way less profitable? You know, the time to have ridden this roller coaster to the top was starting in 2009.
I was going to ask, it's an obvious question to ask, do you think we'll ever see Unifor adopt or be willing to adopt profit sharing in its contract? They've been very opposed to it for a long time.
Well, they've been opposed to it for the reason that Kristen mentioned, but look at the UAW. They're getting profit sharing and pay increases. and Unifor got pay increases in the 2016 round. I've never really understood why they would resist having both. It's almost like walking away from free money, and it's over a principle that doesn't really hold. So what does it cost them? As long as they get the same pay increase that they thought they were going to get, and they got it last time in 16, why they wouldn't do both?
Yeah, my experience ideology is that just they don't think it's appropriate for a union to be tied to the company and profit sharing. They also to my best of my knowledge, we never had the tier 2 in Canada.
No, they have a 10-year grow-in.
Effectively, it's very similar, but again, separating the employees, they were not in favor of that. But my experience with Canada has been, it's hugely about product. The toughest things in negotiations, the economics get sorted out pretty quickly. It gets down to product, and it gets down to the cycle plan issue. If you've got a good cycle plan, it's a reasonable set of negotiations. Jerry Diaz is a very hard bargainer. I remember I was down in Florida. I was down there with the Canadians. They were flocking, and they had a commercial after the Super Bowl. I remember Unifor put out a commercial, and hit on GM's decision on sourcing. So they bargained really hard. I always thought they were extremely fair, but sourcing has been historically the real
well, and ideologically and stylistically very different from the UAW.
I would agree.
So you may have just answered the next question I was going to go to here, but just to put it out there, and I'm kind of now mixing my own questions with questions from that we've received from the group. But the question essentially is, given all of those challenges that Kristen, that you mentioned, that Unifor faces, shrinking footprint, et cetera, the question is, what should be Unifor's bargaining strategy as they go into this round of negotiations?
Well, what it's going to be going in is they're going to be looking for guarantees of product. And there's not much left to guarantee. That's the problem. Oshawa is going away, and it's not going to come back. And that leaves a grand total of 4 assembly plants in the Detroit 3 in Canada. That's it. Now, they're going to try and fully load those plants. And one of them, Brampton, is kind of on the bubble. So that's one of they're going to try and protect what they have, I think.
Yeah, I think, and Diaz is a smart guy. He's scoped this. I'm sure he scoped this thing out. He's all over this and taking a look at the UAW side negotiation.
One question I have for the two of you is, do you think that, UAW, because of the way their contract cycles are now, UAW goes this last year, Unifor goes this year, next year is CAMI. Do you think that sequence matters? That, the UAW comes and negotiates for product and gets $23 billion worth of investments. Does that leave little on the table for Canada? And would Canada fare better if they negotiated in 2018, the UAW in 2019? Should they get out of cycle? Would that change?
I don't think it would change. The company is not doing their product cycle based on who bargains first anyway. These are long-term decisions.
Yes.
I don't think it would make a lot of difference. What may be interesting is to see if Unifor decides to get off of this, everyone else in CAMI Ingersoll, and put everything together.
And that's complicated.
It is very complicated because the Ingersoll contract is a little more company friendly on a lot of work rules and things like that than some of the other plants.
Well, and the CAMI plant was first a joint venture with Isuzu,
right.
And Ford had a joint venture with Mazda, and GM with Toyota, and Chrysler with Mitsubishi.
No. Instead of Isuzu.
Oh, Suzuki. Sorry.
Suzuki.
Sorry, Suzuki. Sorry. I missed up. But those joint venture plants were unionized in the U.S. as well, but had very different contracts. So, is there a way to merge CAMI and CAMI culture with St. Catharines?
That's all they got to merge it with.
Yeah.
Really, and a couple of parts depots.
And they have, geographic spread too. That's one of the things, here in the U.S., a lot of these plants are within a very concentrated footprint in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana. When there's a layoff at one plant or a retooling or something, you can absorb those workers into other plants. Getting somebody in Canada to move from Oshawa to St. Catharines or Oshawa to Ingersoll,
they don't want to move 20 miles.
It's a big deal.
One other new element with Unifor Contract negotiations this year looks like will be a ratified USMCA agreement. I'm seeing stories now that are saying perhaps this week, if I'm reading it right, even today, USMCA could be passed by the Senate. I've seen some happiness from some in Canada about how that worked out for them. Does that help Unifor this year?
I think it's going to take a while, don't you think?
Well, I don't know that it helps the automaker plants in Canada. I think it helps the supply chain in Canada a lot. The higher content rules for North American production, regional value content, and the labor value content, the thing that says that a certain proportion of cars and trucks have to be made at a $16 an hour or higher average wage, really helps high wage supply chain in the U.S. and Canada. But I don't know, Canadian production, they only keep like 12 or 13% of what they make across the whole industry in Canada, and most of their production is sent to the U.S. And they are very import dependent, not just from the U.S., but from Japan, from Europe. They have free trade with countries that represent about half the market for new vehicles. So they can be an export base too, as Mexico does. I don't know that it helps them pick up vehicle production, but I think the supply chain will benefit dramatically. The USMCA is interesting on the union politics. The AFL-CIO is in favor. On NAFTA, they were negative. They were neutral on NAFTA, I'm sorry. But they are in favor of USMCA. The UAW opposed NAFTA, and the UAW is not in favor, is not aligned with the AFL-CIO on USMCA.
So how about then on the U.S. side, Kristen, you in your presentations projected an increase in U.S. production over the next couple of years. How does USMCA play into that? How did it play into the bargaining negotiations that we saw last year?
Well, I think it helps drive the production to, as I said, the higher wage regions, and the U.S. is, you may recall that during the negotiations for USMCA, they're going along, we had an agreement, getting an agreement, and then we imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Steel and aluminum tariffs that outlived the signing of the USMCA. So, there are additional risks that USMCA addresses in side letters to try to minimize any additional impacts from tariffs on other things, or disputes about aircraft or softwood lumber or sugar or other weird commodities that we trade. I think that we've seen a slowdown of investment activity since the 2015 contract across the board in the auto industry. If you look at our pattern of investment, it dropped off right after 2015. We get these big spikes in UAW years because the Detroit 3 announced 4 years worth of investment all at one time. But everyone seems to have been sitting on their hands, waiting to see how the chips are going to fall. We're also at the top of the market. So there's not as much investment necessary for production, but a lot of investment going into technology and product, and the product evolution to electrified, connected, automated vehicle.
And that's another big topic that I thought we should address today. Going into this round of negotiations, the UAW did a lot of research into what the workforce of the future will look like with the auto industry.
Really good paper that they had.
Paper, yeah.
We're of course looking at an industry that is that is gearing up to change over to more electric vehicles. What are the implications of that for the UAW and its membership? And did they achieve their goal at all of attempting to address those future workforce changes that they're facing?
Yeah, I'm certain. I mean, one of the big things is, these are very profitable companies, but Ford, was it last year at the auto show, they announced $11 billion investment in new technologies across products. I mean, there's a lot of competition for dollars within the companies, and labor costs are 5% of overall cost of building a vehicle, but there's a lot of change taking place. And is that the paper you have read? So the paper we're referring to it's on the UAW website. It's called "Taking the High Road: Strategies for a Fair EV Future." And there's a lot of UAW members working in powertrain plants. Two of the three plants that are closing this year are powertrain plants. I'm sorry, 3 of the 4, because Romeo Engine too. That transition is something they've got to be planning for. And with new technologies, and maybe you two can talk about it, and I know Marty, you did some of this. UAW sometimes been willing to give different local agreements in order to capture new technology. So Brownstown Battery, for example, at GM had a different agreement. Right. There was one on Woodhaven stamping for hot stamping technology to go in there. How do you think that the attracting new technology investments goes with bargaining?
If it's brand new technology, and it's not displaced, workers are not being displaced, it's brand coming in, incremental work. Yes, I think the UAW has been willing to sit down and talk about what the wage rate in the competitive industry is. But this one is really complicated, powertrain operations, depending, because you could take a massive plant. We have a lot here in Southeast Michigan in transmissions and engines. And over time, if you go to EV and they're replaced with batteries, it's
Yeah, well, right.
think so.
So hello, everybody. This is Brent, and we lost you guys, and we believe we're back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We're back, and I think we'll just resume and maybe pick up a little bit where we left off. I mean, just to put a finer point on it, we were talking about the workforce of the future as the auto industry changes over to electric vehicles. I mean, we're talking about a number of plants in Southeast Michigan and across the U.S., thousands of UAW workers for GM, Ford, and Chrysler. I mean, there's like 5 plants in Indiana alone that do nothing but build transmissions for FCA. So, I mean, is this how big of a threat is this EV changeover over the next 10, 15 years, do you guys think? Maybe Art or Kristen.
A little bit first. So we've looked at the evolution of electric vehicles as a forecasting effort here at CAR. What we're seeing in the next 2 years is just a mountain of new vehicles coming in that are electric and electrified. Electric F-150, electric Silverado, Rivian, Lordstown Motors, new entrants making electric trucks. You can get, an electric, almost anything you want. But in the interim period, we have a lot more of those electrified. So plug-in hybrids that, while a battery electric vehicle requires way less labor and is less complex to build, hybrid vehicles have two systems, way more parts, way more complexity in building. I think, engine downsizing continues along the lines too. So if you're a supplier that makes valve lifters, you're only going to make 4 on every car or fewer instead of 6 or 8. So volumes in the supply chain for powertrain are declining, even as we see, a majority of vehicles, even going out to 2040, will still have an internal combustion engine in them, as well as a battery system for, in hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and various permutations of the xEV. Pure battery electric and even fuel cell are growing and will be a bigger share in 2040, but they're not going to be the majority even out that far. But I think it's encouraging to see the UAW taking these steps now and thinking about this. They do have technology committees at all 3 companies that look at not just the automation within the factory, but the changes in the product. And I know Ford has had that sort of technological progress committee for a long time. Marty, if you want to talk about how that has worked.
Yeah, it's worked well, and it's very cooperative. We bring some of the research scientists together, and we bring in some people from product development and explain to the UAW how technology is moving in the future. No surprises. But this one in particular is extremely challenging because even in our own nation, most of the lithium battery technology is in China, and the EU has gotten involved. There's limited battery technology within the United States. I think it's Tesla and Panasonic and Nevada. But other than that, if the OEM doesn't have the technology, the patents internally, then you're going to go out to a supplier and purchase that component.
Or a joint venture like GMLG. And
right. Yeah. So there's a lot of questions to be answered in the future on this one.
Well, and despite the UAW making an agreement with GM about Brownstown to get that technology and to have a battery pack assembly plant that was building the packs for the Chevy Volt with a V. When the Chevy Bolt with a B came along, the sourcing went to LG, not Brownstown. So sourcing decisions can really, the sourcing language at some of the automakers was improved and changed from the UAW's perspective in 2019, and greater input into sourcing decisions, into temporary worker decisions and allocations. Just more communication, I think, is what I saw on those points.
But at the end of the day, the company retains the right to source, or they need to source going forward. And it's going to be interesting to how the entire market moves in this area and who's going to be available to purchase those batteries.
Another workforce issue, that was a flashpoint, a little bit more so in this round of negotiations than in the past, but I think it's always there, is the UAW doesn't like or temporary workers and the temporary workforce, and would like to minimize that as much as possible. So we heard a lot about that this year. Can you just talk about what gains, to what degree did the UAW make gains on that front? Did they achieve their goals? Kristen, it looks like you have some thoughts.
I always have thoughts. They don't dislike the workforce. And I think, when second tier first came into play, there was a lot of consideration and thought that there would be friction, somebody standing right next to you making half the wage, and that would cause there to be more disruption in plants and workforce unrest. I don't know that we've seen that based on, I think, legacy workers, those hired before 2007, just feel like the in progression or the second tier people or the temps are just getting a raw deal, and they want them to get what they have, and it's not, hey, why are you here undercutting me? So very, different. They don't dislike the workforce. They dislike the bargains that have made. And they did make some changes on temporary workers. As we said, there's progression based on a calendar of when temporary workers will become permanent, and based on their seniority at GM and Ford. FCA is looking to hire a lot more workers and gave them hiring preference. They're launching a new plant in Detroit. And so, there's a lot of opportunities for hiring. Ford, I think, this might get into pattern bargaining and some of the, I'm going to call it the screw your neighbor nature of bargaining. Ford put in a cap of 8% temps across the corporation, no more than 10% at any one facility. It's non-binding for Ford. Ford's not at that level. But Ford went before FCA, and FCA had a higher percentage of temporary workers. I estimate that we were around 11%. Interesting that FCA did not take that part of the pattern when they negotiated. But, it's a case where, if either FCA or Ford go before GM and took something for pensions, there's way more retired members at GM than there are at the other two companies. And so that would be, paper cut for me and a amputation for you, General Motors. So, there's some of that intercompany dynamic going on, and we did not see FCA pick up that part of either the pattern or of the pattern that Ford pushed it a little further.
Okay. So something we'll come back to you in just 1 second, Art. Something I should have said earlier that I'll say now. We're down to about 10 or 15 minutes. I kind of jumped around and took some questions that we had received from the audience earlier, but if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to get them in quickly, and we'll take a look at them. Art, sorry, did you have an additional follow-up thought there?
One thought on the temporary. There is a path to permanency, and the wages and benefits were approved, but there is still the ability to use temporary, and that's the flexibility issue.
Well, and why do they use temporary?
I was going to say.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Use temporary as well for vacation replacement, for startups, for volume blips. If you're not sure that a volume is going to be maintained, you're going to want to use temporaries, because once you bring on a permanent employee, you're bringing on a lot of obligations that you may not necessarily need. So that flexibility is really necessary in the auto industry, and they maintained that, although they did improve the position of the temps and the economic well-being of the temps as well.
And time off for temps too, which we haven't mentioned. They now have both paid and unpaid time off that is expanded from what they had before.
So throughout this discussion, and we've mentioned it a couple of times, is that there's a bit of an elephant in the room here, which is the federal investigation into the UAW, and a lot has happened, and it looks like a lot still will happen. We haven't really dove into it because it's a difficult topic for even you guys, you experts, to answer. But I guess I would ask this question, maybe of you, Art, which is, if you're sitting at GM or Ford or Chrysler watching this, what are the implications for how the automakers approach the relationship with the UAW and continue that ongoing relationship and prepare for the 2023 round of negotiations?
Well, the companies have to deal with who's ever on the other side. We don't get a choice in that. And this whole investigation has been disappointing, and I don't think anyone, certainly in the company, gains any glee from that. It's an indictment on everything, and it's unfortunate. I think
and company people were involved.
Yes. At FCA. I had a line of thinking which you interrupted right there. When you get to be my age, you got to keep talking, or you'll forget things. the UAW has got to figure out a way out of this, and they've got to gain the trust of the membership again. I think the leadership has lost it somewhat, and I know they're trying to do something, and you know, hopefully they won't be put under trusteeship by the government. They really don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure anybody wants that to happen, to tell you the truth. So this is one that I hope we can put behind us, and the leadership of the UAW can reestablish the trust and the support of the membership.
You had said at the outset that the strike was perhaps inevitable, and in some ways perhaps necessary to gain that membership trust. Are we in a position, and because of the investigation that it was necessary, are we in a position where going forward the UAW has to pull that lever and has to pull that trigger again in order to win the support of the membership for a contract?
Well, you mean we've got 4 years to figure that out.
Yeah.
Hopefully, 4 years from now, this will be behind us. The leadership will be strong.
There'll be new leadership.
You know, of course, we do leadership, yeah, because you can't run after 65 still. So they're going to have all new leadership probably, and as I say, hopefully this will be behind everybody, and it won't be an issue anymore.
Well, I think, you know, it's also worth noting in the contracts they address some of these issues. The training center funds were put into trust under control of the companies. They jointly decide how to spend it on training, but that was one thing of, you know, pulling back some of the control of the funding. The GM CHR, the building on the river in Detroit, is being sold. So there were some changes in the joint training programs, which, you know, seem to be the home to much of the scandal, or a lot of it. The new president of the UAW, Rory Gamble, has instituted a number of reforms. I saw earlier today that he's doing a road show in one of the regions, in Region 1A. I'm looking to see whether that's going to continue and go to other regions where he's going to, you know, talk with members. They are meeting this week, and we may see a new vice president of the Ford department, is what we're expecting to see happen there. But I think the leadership, Art's right, the leadership of the UAW is doing everything it can to try to avoid federal consent decree and takeover of the union. And, you know, it's not in their control about, you know, they can do a lot of things, but ultimately whether that happens or not is not their decision.
So that's big, broad, heavy issues there. We're down to about 5 minutes left for our scheduled session anyway. And so I think I'll just maybe quickly try to address two questions that have come in. And this is a very specific question, I think probably for you, Kristen, which is just how has paid and unpaid time off expanded, and are you able to be more specific about that?
For the temporary workers, or I don't know. So temporary workers, I don't have the details of it right in front of me right now, but they moved to, I think they only had like 8 hours of paid time off or unpaid time off. So that's a question I would be happy to take offline.
Okay.
And in fact, I'll just say right now, I mean, most of the folks on here, well, Art's putting it right in front of me. Thank you. They moved to 40 hours of paid time off and 24 hours of unpaid time off for temporary workers who work more than 12 continuous months, but less than 3 years. And those who work 120 continuous days, but less than 12 months, get 16 hours of paid time off and 24 hours of unpaid time off. And, you know, many of the temps are working really intense schedules. And, you know, like all of us, you've got doctor's appointments and dentist appointments and kids things to do and stuff. So I think, you know, providing that relief to temps was a really important bargaining goal for the union as well, that they could, you know, live their life and not be tied to that job.
Very good. I think.
And I'm happy to take any questions offline. At the end, we'll give my email address and.
Sure. think then we'll wrap up with one more question that dives back into the labor cost issues, which essentially, I'm going to summarize the question a little bit, essentially says, we had talked about how the Detroit 3 can offset some of those labor costs by doing a number of things. The question is essentially, wouldn't the transplants also be able to do those same things? And isn't then, therefore, the disparity enough to force the Detroit 3 to raise prices versus the international or foreign automakers?
I would say the answer is yes, and not necessarily.
So elaborate on that, Art.
Obviously, they can do the same, but, who does it better? And who achieves more? If you look at the productivity stuff, the old Harbor report stuff that used to be public, I don't get to see it anymore, but the Detroit 3 really closed the gap with the Japanese, so they did make the improvement. So it's a matter of who does it better and who puts what into operation. And you can, if they improve 2% and the Detroit 3 improve 4% a year, that's an improvement. That's a gain. That helps, and that can offset some labor. So that's just my view on it.
And who's in a better position footprint-wise to take advantage of the USMCA? I mean, some of the international automakers are very high U.S. content, but maybe not so much North American content, where they can blend in, Mexico's lower wages and lower costs into their formula. That competition to take best advantage of the new trade agreement, I think, is another area where, like Art said, if one group has 2% gains and the other has 4%, then, the one who gets 4% wins.
Very good. There you go. Very good. Well, listen, we have run now almost exactly an hour and a half, which is what we had promised from the outset. And from my perspective, I think this was what we had aimed for here, which is a good, robust discussion of the implications of the 2019 contract negotiations with some very good experts who have a lot of experience in this area. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and want to thank Marty and Art and Kristen for your time and preparation. I'll just allow Kristen to jump back in now. You had promised contact info.
Yep.
And whatever else you want to say to wrap up today.
I put it in the chat.
Okay, so Sean here put that in chat. I'll let you know that there's a shorter version if you want to just write to KDZ, Kangaroo Dog Zebra. You do not have to spell my nice Polish name with multiple Z's in it. KDZ@cargroup.org. If you have any follow-on questions or want to engage in a conversation about the topics we had here, or you want to get in touch with Art or Marty or Brent about any of the things that we discussed, I will be your conduit for that. So KDZ@cargroup.org. I want to thank everyone for joining and dialing in. We got good audience participation and good questions. Thank you, Brent, for moderating, Marty and Art for providing your insights and expertise on this topic. And with that, it's a wrap.